Nobody warned us that the world would change with a single signature on a piece of paper. Nobody told us that one morning, ordinary men, mechanics, teachers, soldiers, accountants, would open an envelope and find not a draft notice for war, but something that felt, in that first cold moment, like a sentence far worse than any battlefield. An order to marry beings who had come down from the stars, for the survival of the entire human race. And nobody, not the government, not the scientists, not even the alien women themselves, could have predicted that out of this desperate, forced, almost cruel arrangement would come a story that would redefine what the word family meant for two entirely different species. This didn't start with love. It started with fear. 3 years before the day this story really begins, a species calling themselves the Kaelith arrived on Earth. Not with weapons, but with an ultimatum so strange that half the governments on the planet assumed it was some kind of elaborate hoax or a stress test of their leadership. The Kaelith were tall, pale-skinned beings with eyes the color of molten gold, and what they told humanity was as simple as it was terrifying. Their species was dying. Genetic collapse, the result of thousands of years of breeding within an increasingly narrow gene pool, had brought them to the edge of extinction. Their scientists had found exactly one solution, and that solution was humanity. The only species they'd ever encountered whose genetics were compatible enough that hybrid offspring didn't just survive. They thrived, inheriting human resilience and adaptability alongside Kaelith longevity and intellect. The Kaelith didn't propose conquest. They didn't propose slavery. They proposed a resettlement and marriage program, sanctioned by their government and, after months of brutal, closed-door negotiations, accepted by the governments of Earth under threat of something almost as bad as invasion. Total technological and economic blackout from the wider galactic community the Kaelith were part of. Without access to their technology, humanity would be set back decades at the exact moment the planet desperately needed new energy sources, cures for diseases nobody could crack, and protection from threats in deep space that most people didn't even know existed. And so Executive Order 7743 was born, the Forced Placement Program. Thousands of men across the globe, selected by genetic compatibility screening, received orders that could not be appealed. The language was cold, bureaucratic, stripped of anything resembling compassion. Citizen is required to report for marital union in the interest of national and planetary security. Among the men who received that notice was Marcus Reeves, 29 years old, a mechanic from a small town outside Pittsburgh, a man who wanted, more than almost anything else in his life, to not be told who he was going to spend the rest of his life with by a government form. He sat alone in his cramped apartment above the auto shop, holding a piece of paper stamped with an official seal, and felt something rise in his chest that wasn't fear. It was rage, pure, helpless rage. "This is insane," he muttered into the empty room. "They can't just decide this for me." But the government could. And it did. 2 weeks later, Marcus stood in a massive holding facility outside Washington, D.C., a sterile, gray building constructed specifically for this purpose, alongside hundreds of other men, every one of them wearing the same expression, a mix of resignation, anger, and a fear they were all trying very hard not to show. Nobody talked. Nobody made eye contact. They all just waited, staring at the large steel doors at the far end of the room, doors that were about to decide the rest of their lives. When those doors finally opened, and the Kaelith walked in, the first wave, brought in for the assignment ceremony, a collective, involuntary breath went through the crowd. They were beautiful, and there was something in that beauty that felt deeply, unsettlingly alien. Tall, slender, their skin faintly luminous, their eyes pooling gold like molten metal. They moved with a grace no human body could replicate. But underneath that inhuman beauty, Marcus saw something he wasn't expecting to see at all. Fear. The exact same fear he felt himself. The woman who stopped in front of him, her name was Sariel, he'd learned, Looked at him, Marcus Reeves, she said through a translator device clipped to her collar, and even Mechanot with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the anxiety of someone who understood exactly as little about what was happening as he did. Icily processed, her voice trembled. Yeah, he said flatly, crossing his arms. And you're my... He couldn't make himself say the word wife. My name is Sariel, she said quietly. And believe me, I like this about as much as you do. The words caught him completely off guard. He'd expected coldness, arrogance, the indifference of a being who saw humans as nothing more than genetic material. Instead, he found someone just as trapped, just as powerless against a bureaucratic machine that had decided their fate without asking either of them. Then why are you here? He asked, sharper than he meant to. Sariel closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, there was a pain in her voice he wasn't ready for. Because my people are dying, she said simply. Because back home, more children are born sick than healthy. Because my little sister was born with a condition our healers can't cure, and the doctors told us that if nothing changes, the next generation might be the last one. I'm not here because I want to be here, Marcus Reeves. I'm here because someone had to come, and I decided it was better if that someone was me instead of her. The words hung in the cold, recycled air of the processing center, and Marcus felt his carefully built-up anger, 2 weeks in the making, start to crack under the weight of something more complicated. Something like sympathy he didn't want to feel, but couldn't fight off. I'm sorry about your sister, he said finally, and he meant it. Sariel looked at him, surprised, like she hadn't expected anything but hostility. Thank you, she whispered. That was how a story began that was supposed to be a simple, cold transaction, and instead turned into something far more complicated and far more human than the bureaucrats who wrote Executive Order 7743 could ever have imagined. The first few months were brutal. Marcus and Sariel lived in a government-assigned apartment, but between them stretched a canyon. Not just cultural, but emotional. He was angry at a system that had stripped him of the right to choose. She grieved for a home she might never see again, for a family left light years away, for a life taken from her by the same merciless calculus of galactic politics that had taken his freedom from him. They barely spoke. They ate at different times. They slept in separate rooms, even though the government paperwork assumed they'd be living as a married couple in every sense of the word. Every evening Marcus came home from the shop, grease still under his fingernails, and found Sariel sitting by the window, staring up at the stars with a longing so deep it made his chest ache despite every ounce of resentment he was still holding on to. Then one night, about 2 months into their forced marriage, a ceremony so clinical and loveless it had felt more like signing a contract than starting a life together, Marcus woke up to the sound of quiet crying coming from the next room. He lay there in the dark, arguing with himself. Part of him wanted to just roll over, pretend he hadn't heard it. But another part of him, the part that still made him human, not just a victim of circumstance, got him out of bed and walked him to her door. Sariel, he called softly, knocking. You okay in there? Silence, then a shaking voice. Come in. He opened the door and found her sitting on the bed, knees pulled to her chest, gold eyes wet with tears that looked, strangely, exactly like human tears, bright, salty, full of pain. I dreamed about my sister, she said. I dreamed she died while I was here, millions of miles away, unable to do anything about it. I don't even know if she's still alive. Messages between our worlds take months. I might never know if what I sacrificed actually saved her, or if it was all for nothing. Marcus stood in the doorway, feeling something inside him finally give way completely. The wall of anger and resentment he'd spent 2 months building, crumbling under the weight of a pain that felt uncomfortably, undeniably similar to his own. He sat down on the edge of the bed, not touching her, but close enough that she'd know she wasn't alone. Tell me about her, he said quietly. Your sister. Sariel looked at him, startled. And then, for the first time in 2 months, she smiled, a small, pained smile, but a real one. "Her name is Lyra," she began. "She's about 9 years old in your years. She loves drawing the constellations she can see from our window, even though she's never actually been to half of them." They talked all night. Marcus told her about his mother, who died of cancer 5 years earlier, and about the empty apartment full of memories he couldn't hold on to or let go of. Sariel told him about her homeworld. Cities built inside massive crystalline structures. A culture where music wasn't heard through the ears but transmitted directly into the nervous system, evoking emotions so intense that most Kaelith considered human music, heard through simple ears, a primitive but touchingly honest way to express feeling. By sunrise, as the first light broke through the curtains, Marcus realized something he never expected to realize. He no longer saw Sariel as an obligation forced on him. He saw her as a person, or rather, as a being whose fear, pain, and hope were every bit as real as his own. Months passed. Slowly, carefully, like two people who'd both been burned once by trust, Marcus and Sariel began building something that actually resembled a marriage. Not one dictated by an executive order, but one they chose every single day. She learned to cook his favorite comfort food, even though her body reacted badly to some of the spices. He started learning the Kaelith language, just so he could talk to her without a cold mechanical voice standing between them. But the galaxy, it turned out, wasn't ready to let go so easily of a program that had accidentally turned forced marriages into something resembling real love. A year after first contact, as tens of thousands of similar marriages across the planet began producing their first results, remarkably healthy, unusually resilient children who'd inherited the best traits of both species, a rift began to grow within Kaelith society itself. Not every Kaelith supported the resettlement program. A conservative faction calling themselves the Purity Wardens saw interbreeding with what they considered a primitive species as an insult to their ancient culture, a betrayal of millennia of heritage in exchange for simple biological survival. One evening, Marcus came home from the shop to find Sariel standing by the window, her face frozen in an expression of terror he'd only seen once before, the day they first met. "What happened?" he said, rushing to her. "The Purity Wardens," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They've seized control of the transport fleet that runs between our worlds. They've declared the resettlement program treason, and they've announced that every Kaelith who married a human must be immediately repatriated, and their children." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "What about the children?" Marcus asked, feeling cold dread creep up his spine. "They consider them impure," Sariel whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "They want them eliminated." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Marcus felt the same rage he'd felt on the first day at the processing center come flooding back. But this time, it wasn't directed at a government that had forced him to marry. It was directed at anyone willing to murder innocent children in the name of some twisted idea of racial purity. "They're not touching any of our kids," he said firmly. He and Sariel didn't have children yet, but the very idea of anyone killing innocents over a doctrine of blood purity lit something in him. The same stubborn defiance that, it turned out, ran through his entire species. "Marcus," Sariel whispered, "their fleet outclasses anything Earth can put up in defense. They have ships that can wipe out any resistance from orbit in minutes." "Then we won't fight them with ships," Marcus said, and something hard and determined burned behind his eyes. "We'll fight with what we've got." Over the following weeks, something began happening across the planet that nobody had predicted, least of all the Kaelith planning their punitive expedition. Tens of thousands of mixed couples, men and women who'd started their marriages under duress but had found real love and real partnership in them, banded together into an unprecedented resistance coalition. Engineers shared technology they'd learned from their Kaelith spouses. Military officers developed tactics that combined human ingenuity with alien knowledge of space combat. Marcus, a mechanic by trade, turned out to be an unexpectedly valuable link in this resistance network. His technical knowledge, combined with everything Sariel had taught him about Kaelith ship architecture, helped a team of engineers develop weapons capable of piercing the shield technology used by the Purity Warden's fleet. But the real battle wasn't fought in space. It was fought in the hearts and minds of the Kaelith themselves. As the Purity Warden's fleet approached Earth, preparing for what they called their cleansing operation, Sariel did something nobody expected. Not even her own people. Using a direct neural broadcast frequency, available only to high-ranking members of Kaelith society, she addressed not humanity, but her own countrymen aboard the approaching fleet. "You call us traitors," she said, standing beside Marcus in their small apartment, now turned into an improvised command center. "But what's your alternative? Let our species die in isolation, proud and pure, but dead all the same? I've watched humans, the ones you call primitive, give their lives protecting children they've never even met, simply because our blood runs in their veins alongside our own. Isn't that exactly what we've always been looking for, a way to survive without losing who we are?" Her words, broadcast across every communication channel in the fleet, reached the hearts of many soldiers and officers who were themselves following Purity Warden orders while privately doubting the righteousness of what they were about to do. When the fleet entered Earth's orbit, ready to launch its attack, something happened that Purity Warden Command had never anticipated. A third of the ships refused to carry out the attack order. Crews moved by Sariel's words, and more importantly, by the real stories of love and sacrifice that had been spreading through the galactic network for weeks, mutinied against their own commanders. The battle that should have been a massacre turned into a civil war within the Purity Warden fleet itself. While Earth's resistance forces, using hybrid technology developed by mixed couples across the planet, launched precision strikes against the ships still willing to continue the attack. Marcus stood beside Sariel in the command center, watching the battle unfold on the screens, knowing this fight would decide the fate of their marriage, their future children, and possibly the relationship between two species forever. "Whatever happens," he said, taking her hand, "I don't regret a single day I've spent with you, even if it all ends today." Sariel looked at him, and the same fire he felt burning in his own chest reflected back in her golden eyes. Not fear, but resolve. "Executive Order 7743 forced us to marry," she said quietly. "But everything we built after that was our choice. And I choose to be with you, Marcus Reeves, until my last breath, if that's what it takes." The battle lasted 7 hours. 7 hours that felt like an eternity to millions of people watching the fight unfold in the sky above them, not knowing if they'd live to see another sunrise. But when the smoke cleared, and the wreckage of the Purity Warden ships that had refused to stand down burned out in orbit, it was clear. The coalition of humanity in Kaelith, united not by executive order, but by real love and shared purpose, had won. In the months that followed, the wider galactic community, watching this conflict with cautious interest, acknowledged something that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. Marriages between humans and Kaelith, born out of a forced government order, had become the most successful biological and cultural experiment in the history of both species. Children born from these unions weren't just healthy. They possessed a unique combination of human resilience and Kaelith wisdom that many scientists called an evolutionary leap unlike anything seen before. Marcus and Sariel, 2 years after that first cold day at the processing center, stood on the balcony of their apartment, looking up at the stars, holding their newborn daughter, a baby girl with her mother's golden eyes and her father's stubborn spirit, whom they named Lyra, in honor of the sister who had survived thanks to the sacrifice her own sister made 3 years before. "You know," Marcus said quietly, looking down at their sleeping daughter, "if someone had told me the day I got that letter that it would all end up like this, I wouldn't have believed them." Sariel smiled, leaning into him. An order created to save two species from extinction and war, she said, turned into the start of something no government could have ever predicted. Not just survival, a real family. Somewhere far across the galaxy, members of the wider galactic community studied the data on this remarkable union between two species, trying to understand the secret of its success. But the answer they were looking for in complex genetic formulas and sociological models was, in the end, remarkably simple. The same answer humanity had given to every impossible situation throughout its entire history, every trial thrown at it by fate or the stars themselves. Humans didn't just survive. They found a way to love even where there seemed to be no room left for it at all. And that stubborn, unbreakable humanity turned out to be the most valuable thing humanity could ever offer the galaxy. Not weapons, not technology, but a heart capable of turning coercion into choice, and choice into the strongest bond in the universe.